Cool. So I will get the recording started. So if anybody can't make it live, they can always catch the recording and still learn all of the things.
Okay, great.
Awesome. And so I suppose, I don't know if these folks know you, if they tuned in for our last webinar, but can I have you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, yeah. And everyone has the PDF, is that right?
I believe so.
Okay,
If
cool.
anybody did not receive the PDF that I emailed either last night or very early this morning, if you signed up today, please type it into the Q&A box and or the chat so I can send that to you real quick.
Cool. Okay, I'm just seeing this chat now too. That's cool. I've not seen that before. All right. My name is Emily Thomas. I'm a writer. I'm also a producer. I worked on the TV show Longmire for 6 seasons, 3 seasons on A&E, and then 3 seasons on Netflix. I also worked at William Morris Endeavor for a year. Prior to that, I've worked at Jerry Bruckheimer. I've worked in documentary. I'm a prep producer and an on-set producer and a drama writer. I'm not a comedy writer, but I can instruct comedy writing. So anyone who's interested in writing a comedy, I think we can apply this 4-part lecture series to comedy writing really easily. So if you have any one-off questions, I know Alex mentioned that we can go over those today. We can also, if there's other stuff that people need to know, we can maybe request questions prior to the next session and I can take a look and kind of cater things. So I'm a writer, I'm a producer, I mostly work in drama. I also have a background on the agency side and previous to that in documentary. So there we go.
Awesome. Cool. So I'm just going to forward the handout to Miss Judy real quick because she signed up kind of late and had not received it. So Miss Judy, you should have it in your inbox. If you don't see it here in a couple minutes, shoot me another little message and I will send it to you in a different way, but I'll get it to you, I promise.
Do you see also April? I'm seeing this chat. April is saying she didn't receive the PDF. And I just want to make sure I can talk this through without anyone having eyes on the PDF. I do think it will be helpful. So I guess you guys, if you can utilize the chat feature, I'm not as familiar with Zoom as maybe others, but if you can utilize the chat feature, let us know if you don't have it. And if you don't have it, just listen and you'll get the PDF later and it will all make even more sense.
Cool. And then I can probably forward it to Miss April real quick.
Okay, great.
Not a big deal, especially now that I've already got it pulled up. Awesome. Okay, so while I'm doing that, do we just want to dive on in?
Sure, yeah. Okay, so this is a 4-part series. The goal here is to talk through enough of the foundational information that one might need in order to write a pilot, talk through those steps in 4 parts. So today is part 1 of 4. My hope is that I can, I'm seeing chats now too. I'm gonna try not to be distracted by that. Log lines and pitches. I'm gonna really quickly dip into this question. I'm gonna probably not review log lines and pitches. However, if we have questions that are one-off like that, we can dive into that. The first thing we're going to do today in part 1 of 4 parts is review the listing of topics that I'm going to touch on. And you'll see that log lines and pitches aren't in there. I've taught pilot writing in a variety of settings, one-on-one, one-on-one freelance clients, university level, art centers, this kind of a forum. And every time there are different requirements, a different number of sessions and hours. If it's a full college course, you know what that looks like. This is, I think, in our world of 4 sessions, probably about 6 hours. That's not a lot of time to talk about how to write a pilot. So the pitches and the log lines, I want to give you as much base knowledge as is possible, because the idea of a pitch and a log line would suggest that you've already written something so intact and ready to roll that you need a log line and a pitch. I think that's a step ahead of where we are. Where we are is, if you want to sit down and write a pilot, what is step 1? So the goal of this 4-part series is to talk about not only here's base information that you're going to need, but also here's a guided process. So we're not going to be going through that guided process together, but every session I am going to give you suggestions of, if I were you and I were to sit down and write a pilot, here would be steps 1 through X to get you where you need to go. And then this is a quick 1 month thing, but if you have all the time in the world because you're at home right now, and many of us are, and maybe you're not working, you could, in theory, go through these steps and bust out a pilot. And if you can't, because you don't have that time in these 4 weeks, you could take these steps and space them out into the future. So, okay, part 1, number 1, expectations for the 4-part lecture. So this is a listing of the topics that we're going to cover today and in 3 future sessions. So if you don't have the PDF yet, that's fine. Just listen along. If you do have the PDF, we are at the top of page 1. Okay, part 1 topics. So this will be covered today. Why do we tell stories and why is story important? Seems rudimentary, but I think just to get us all on the same page. Number 2, origin of ideas. The 3rd is breaking story. And to clarify, this will be individually, not as a group, which is to say in a writer room. We're going to talk about individual story breaking. And then theme versus story versus plot. So that will be the first part of today. That will be the topics. The second part of today will be a step-by-step instruction of sorts of where you could begin. Okay, next session will be character, boarding, using note cards, genres, formulas and formats and frameworks. These words are often interchangeable. You'll see what I mean when we get there. POV, point of view, structure, story circle, and reversals. That's going to be the second session. The third is going to be what I would like to call scene justification, outlining, beat sheets, and world building. And then the final session will be dialogue, voicing, something I call the unit of doing, which you may not hear anywhere else. It's just a way that something has been described to me that's been very useful. And then transitioning to script. So you'll see that to me, 1, 2, 3, and 4 parts here as outlined only bring us to transitioning to script. However, to clarify, if it's me and the way that I write and the way that I've been taught in a professional writer room, the actual transition to script is where you do probably the lightest lifting. These preliminary steps, including the boarding, is really where you are doing the writing. And the last thing we touch on is dialogue and voicing, because that's kind of the last step of preparing for utilizing script software to actually sit down and hit the keys. So hopefully, even if this guideline doesn't work for you of talking about origin of ideas and going all the way to talking about dialogue, but never actually getting to the FDX file, if that's not for you, toss this out the window. You can go your own way. However, the information we're going to talk about world building and character development and structure, that could be applied and should be applied to whatever your process is. Okay, so this is my proposal would be the writing is in the preparation. If that's not your style and you want to just sit down and hit the keys, then I'm going to at least teach you things that I think it's important for you to know before you start that process. Okay? Okay, so we're going to get into the first topic for the part 1 session. The first topic is why do we tell stories and why is story important? So I'm going to read from the page. I might riff a little. If you want to follow along, feel free. Okay, to state the obvious, all of life is story, and in this way, I personally believe that it's critical. We tell stories to make sense of ourselves and our experiences and our world. We certainly do write for others, especially on a professional level. It's a commerce-driven art in many ways when we're talking about TV, but really we're writing for ourselves. Story can help us sort through the biggest questions. How do we get here? What the heck are we doing here? What comes next? These are things that we're trying to figure out. And I know that this seems really basic. I am going to connect it into the very important topics of theme and story and plot. So bear with me. Okay, there are many important stories in religious tradition, which offer us an avenue to bring framework to these intangible concepts. because story is a vehicle for understanding deeper truth, not just in religion, but in all places. Story can bridge the gap between our experiences and our emotions. Oftentimes breaking meaning to be boarding using note cards to talk about story and boarding out beats. Oftentimes that breaking process can be self-revelatory. We aren't always consciously aware of our deepest feelings and our impressions about our experiences. So when we sit down to write, we write with an agenda. We think we know ourselves and the themes we're hoping to explore, but oftentimes storytelling forces us to confront issues that we didn't realize required or needed attention. And for everyone following along, we're on page 2. Stories on the small screen in particular, so television, offer an audience the opportunity to follow characters over the course of multiple seasons. I think that this is the strength of television, which I think is the easy way to differentiate television script writing from film script writing. So film script writing is more typically, although not as a rule, but more typically is plot driven, and television screenwriting is more typically about character development over time. Okay, so when we're working in TV, this character development over time allows an audience to see a mirror of their own experiences and their emotions. So even if the specifics of the plot have no relevance to an audience member's life, the range of emotions that we can capture in high quality television covers the gamut of experience. So I'm sure you've all experienced I haven't experienced that situation that I'm seeing on screen, but I can see myself in that experience of emotion. Recognizing yourself in others via story can be very validating. It often leaves us feeling more connected to our fellow humans and less isolated from ourselves and the people around us. I think a very easy connection here is that while we're all likely social distancing and at home and we're trying to feel connected, maybe when we do not, who isn't binge watching television right now? Everyone. And it's not just to pass the time, it's to feel a human connection. Okay, transitioning to origin of ideas. So the first question to ask when developing a new idea is, am I the right person to tell this story? And I think it is a cliche, and I think I can unpack it in a way that leaves it feeling less cliche. It is true that you should write what you know, but I'm going to challenge that a little bit. First of all, you can't set aside a perspective that you do have, meaning who you are is going to show up on the page no matter what, but you also can't fake a perspective that you don't have. Often that will leave your writing feeling inauthentic. If you write the things that you don't know, an audience is going to sense that lack of authenticity, and your characters in your story are probably going to fall flat. Sometimes an audience can't articulate what feels wrong, but it's an instinctual, I call BS on that kind of response. But let's talk about this a little bit more. So original concepts, something for which you have no intellectual property that you're drawing from, it's just of your own creation. Original concepts, so drawing on personal experience and perspective. Okay, here's how I think we can bust through the cliche of write what you know. I'm going to extrapolate on this a little bit. I'm going to read from the page at the bottom of 2, and then I might get a little extemporaneous. Okay, what experiences have had the greatest impact on who you are? Don't ignore your own experiences, even if they feel mundane. You can find the theme in the experience and apply it to any story you tackle, because we're all mining our own material. Okay, for me, this is critical. The idea that you write what you know, I think for many years I thought writing what I knew was about writing about literal, kind of tangible, experiential knowledge. So I have spent years of my life in my youth babysitting. So that's an experience, that's something I know. But the truth is, the babysitting is about so much more than just watching the children and collecting the cash, right? So when we talk about drawing on personal experience and writing what we know, for me, it's a thematic transfer. So let's stick with babysitting. So riffing here, what does it mean to care deeply and take responsibility for something that is not yours, right? Children that aren't mine. What kind of thematic implication exists in the idea that at a very young age, just because of the social norm of babysitting, I was left alone to care for other people's children. Maybe these parents didn't even know me that well. There's a lot to consider there. So I've never adopted a child, but I think I could draw on the thematic, emotional experience of babysitting to apply something that I do know to an experience I've never had. Okay, so that's how we talk about writing what we know. It's thematic, it's not strictly experiential. It's how that experience, what it did inside of us, how it made us feel, and what we now understand emotionally that we didn't understand before. Okay, top of page 3, how to brainstorm. This might seem basic, but let's cover it anyway. Clip and save magazine and newspaper articles that are inspirational for your process. Sometimes an idea binder can be helpful. Always carry a notebook, make notes on the fly. I don't do this. I keep it in my phone and I do make notes time to time, but everyone has a different process. This could resonate with you. I would say throw out your first 3 ideas about anything, because typically where you go, the first 3 things are going to be super obvious and you want to dig deeper. Spend time making public observations, not during social distancing, but you know what I mean. Research areas of interest. I think research is a super underappreciated necessity of storytelling, especially if we talk about writing what we know thematically and we apply it to plots that we've never experienced. That's when you're bridging the gap between emotion that you've experienced and action-oriented plot that you've never experienced. So research. Okay, this happens to me sometimes. Have you ever seen a movie where you had a preconceived idea of how the story was going to go, but then it went somewhere different? I always tend to note, oh, that's not what I thought was going to happen. I thought X was going to happen, because every story is a version of another story. Okay, source material, existing intellectual property, AKA IP. It's an IP. This, for a buyer, shows a proof of concept and makes it, at times, makes the idea more attractive to a potential buyer if you're in the business of selling your material. Source material must be optioned, typically for a fee, even if it's just $1, to be legally usable. Options usually run for a 1-year term. Sometimes there's an extension period. Sometimes this is contingent on different terms, and if you have steps completed or an after attached, and that's really down the line, and that's more commerce driven, but just, I would like to just put those 2 buckets, original concept and intellectual property, something based on pre-existing material. Okay, next big topic, breaking story. So breaking story refers to the process that should be if you're reading along, of developing seeds, refers to the process of developing seeds of ideas. So seeds of ideas, just an initial thought, into fully fleshed and organized acts, episodes, and seasons. After you have a basic overview of the story that you want to tell, ask yourself, how can I get where I want to go? If you know your final, let's call it a cliffhanger, reverse engineer your acts to get where you need to go. If you have scene ideas, but no cliffhanger, ask yourself where your scenes could organically take you. Okay, there's 2 ways to break story, individually or with a partner and in a group. We are only going to talk about the individual process, but just something to know is that the group process of breaking story is essentially the writer room. Okay, we're on the top of page 4. So the process of breaking story individually is often going to look very much like a writer room, only you're alone and you have to kind of riff off of your own thoughts. Just pause for 1 moment. Okay, so the suggestion would be talk to yourself out loud, which in essence is kind of what I'm doing right now, right? So this process of talking to no one, because that's kind of how it feels for me, feels more natural for me than others, because this is often how I work. I have to get my brain moving by talking to myself out loud. So I would suggest challenging yourself, even if that feels unusual. Talk out loud the way you would with another person. So for me, sometimes I'm like, but what would that mean? Well, why would she go there? And I just kind of let that verbal process happen. Another approach, one that I use, is free writing exercises or brainstorming and writing out hand notes. So the same way that I'm proposing you speak out loud, I would also propose doing notes with, you can use your computer. I like the idea of using by hand, and I have notebooks for different projects that are different colors. And I literally write out, what if, whatever. And then I will write out the questions on the page, the same questions I would ask in a brainstorming session in a group. I think this is a great way to keep your mind engaged, because you have to start somewhere. I think so frequently we think you have an idea and you sit down at your computer and you write it. That's not really going to get you where you need to go. You need to kind of follow every thread that your brain can toss out to its natural conclusion. And then from there, you're able to continue riffing on the page until you know where you're going. So for me, I do hand notes in a notebook. Even though I'm a fast typer, I find that the process is more fluid with a pen, and there's also more to do with that, and we're going to talk that through. So you write out the questions, you write out your thoughts and your suggestions to yourself, and I keep specific notebooks for story breaking and binders for research and articles of interest. And then after I have kind of done this thought dumping process for days or weeks or months of brainstorming, I read through all of my notes from the beginning. And by then, as you go along with your process, you've asked and answered so many of your own questions that many things are moot. So I go through from the beginning, and I take a highlighter, and this is the other important part, I think, of this process. I take a highlighter and I highlight the best ideas or any thoughts that still serve the story that I think I'm settling on. And then I ignore any holdovers from previous iterations of the idea, anything I've moved past in the breaking process. So I will highlight and I will circle with a pen big sections that live and that are important for the next phase. And then if it's useful at any juncture, you can include other people in your process for feedback and bouncing around ideas. And sorry, it's storming about to, and my dog is a little sad. So I apologize if that's distracting. I think that community writer groups or homespun groups, like writers and friends and contacts, I'm gonna let him into my bedroom. I'm sorry, excuse me one moment. Come on, brother, come in here. Professional writers who I know, they are involved in writer groups, friends of theirs, their contemporaries, their career contemporaries, or people who they just really value their work. And I think having the writer groups keeps you on track with your process, gives you deadlines, and it helps you to say, okay, here's what I've done on my own. This is what I'm thinking. What am I missing? In essence, I've never thought about it this way, but I think it's a good way to think about it. If you're a proponent of talk therapy, the process of therapy of reframing and people asking, your therapist asking new questions so that you can look at things differently, I think that's the value and benefit of a writer group. Okay, so that brings us through the breaking process, which means you get a notebook, you start jamming it out, you do research that is necessary, and once you feel like you've really gotten it all down, you go back through and you highlight and you circle the things that still live for what you're planning to do. And then you talk to friends, colleagues, and you bring them up to speed and you see if there's anything that you're missing. And that's the individual breaking process. We're going to talk about boarding another day, and that's another part of the process. That's step 2. But for today, we're just going to talk about the pieces of the puzzle where we are doing the thought dumping and the research. Okay, now we're going to transition into the next section, which is theme versus story versus plot. And this is where I think it's really critical to understand these concepts and to appreciate them for what they mean to television writing. And I think it's why I like to start with stories and why it's very important. And that can feel a little pie in the sky for many people. But here's where I think my internet connection is unstable. So I apologize if this is getting fuzzy for anyone. All right, we begin with theme. So theme is what story is really about. And when we talk about TV being about ideas, we're referring to theme, not the plot or the story. Okay, story This is, I liked if you're a visual person. For me, theme is the big header. Then next is story. So story is everything that has happened in the story world to inform the plot, even if it's an imaginary world off camera and is never presented on screen. So story means everything that has happened in the history of this world to bring us where we are today, and everything that's going to happen later that hasn't happened yet is all part of the story. If you're sitting around a campfire and you tell me your story, you're telling me the beginning, middle, and end, everything I need to know. If I'm writing a TV show, I'm taking the full thing and I'm breaking it down into smaller pieces, and that would bring us to plot. One more thing I want to say about story can get a little conflated. I'm proposing that story is about everything that's happened in this world before and after and during the pilot or the episode. Story is also about things that have happened off screen. If you're in a show like 24, which is real time and happening, we're seeing every minute with that character on screen, we're still not even seeing every minute of every character's world, and that's all part of the story. So if we hear a tea kettle whistle at the end of one scene, and then in the next scene, they're sitting with their tea, but we didn't see them pour it, in the story, they poured it, but it's not in the plot. Okay, so theme is the idea, what it's really all about. Story is the full picture of everything that's happened, and then plot is every scene that is used to tell the story. So it's what's actually on the page and presented for an audience. Okay, now I think this is very important. Story is the vehicle of theme, and plot is the vehicle of story. So we use the plot, we use the scenes that are selected and the words that we write and the dialogue that's there. We are just milking it to tell a story, and we're milking the story to talk about a big idea. If you're still with me, let's dive into theme, top of page 5. Okay, traditionally, the broad strokes of theme are about establishing opposing forces, and everybody kind of knows these: man versus man, man versus nature. Theme should be the starting point of all story breaking, and it is the essential and essential DNA of a script. So theme is how we get an audience invested in our story, and it's how we make them care and win their emotional investment. Establishing theme allows you to make clear and divisive choices throughout your breaking and writing process. If a beat in a scene or a line of dialogue or a full scene doesn't serve your theme, then you just know that it's out, because you know what you're driving toward and the master that you serve, meaning what am I setting out to talk about? And why am I writing a pilot? I'm writing a pilot to talk about this theme. Okay, series as a full multiple season series have themes, seasons have themes, episodes have themes. And in my experience in a professional writer room, we always were establishing our theme and putting it on the board and coming back to it. If we were stuck, it's like, okay, wait, what's our theme? What's this episode theme? Let's get back to that. And that will help you get where you need to go. Okay. How to find your personal theme. This is a suggestion as a writer, because who you are and your personal themes are going to arrive on the page, whether you want them there or not. So here would be my suggestion to consider these questions. What events have most formed who you are? And of those events, those events that you can get in your mind, what have these events meant for you emotionally and not to you intellectually? If you're having trouble identifying the experiences that have had the most impact, what personal truths can you never put down or set aside? One way to look at this is, I'll just use a personal experience. My parents have been divorced since I was young. I can't put that aside. My experience has been traveling between two households. So that's the kind of thing that I think has this deep impact that we can't set aside, even if the impact is positive. Okay, consider the metaphors of your life. Explore theme as a question. I think this is for me, this is a useful suggestion. Hopefully it will be for you as well. Exploring theme as a question is really critical, because themes aren't about deciding X is true. Themes are about exploration of what is and isn't true and what's the gray area. All of TV is trying to talk about ideas, not demand that you agree with what we're saying. So I think this approach can be helpful because theme is more often about exploring ideas rather than answering questions. If you had to give yourself a personal word that most applies to who you think you are and how you view yourself, what would that word be? It's another way into theme. So from the theme section, super quickly, as an example, the TV show Dexter. If somebody said, what is Dexter about? Probably most commonly, the answer would be Dexter is about a serial killer, and Dexter is about police in Miami, and Dexter is about this loner guy. I would argue that that's not the case. That's the plot, but Dexter is about themes. There are so many themes in every show, but just riffing off the top of my head here. So some of the Dexter themes could be, and this is, I think, a perfect example and one I've used probably in the last lecture that I did with Roadmap. What does morality look like? Is anyone really good or bad? Should people be punished? So you're getting the idea, I'm sure. There's a lot to be explored that has nothing to do with the plot movements that help us talk about the themes. So, okay. Let me see if there's anything else I want to talk about with theme. Another theme thing, the events that have most formed you, have they been within your control or beyond your control? That's also something, because you'll bring that to your writing. Are your characters going through things beyond their control? Are they creating their worlds? It's good to have your head around that. Okay, story. So when brainstorming and world building, many parts of the story concept will be left off the page, but the story itself is important for developing the broader landscape of the plot. This is something that many people may have heard of on the B side. The roots of this expression are in vinyl records with B-sides and tracks that weren't always part of the main album. But the idea is you may never hear the B-side songs, but they're still a part of the whole. And then on top of page 6, we are at off-camera, off-screen. Sometimes off-camera and off-screen are terms, this is the distinction here, are terms used within scripts to identify when a character is yelling from another room. So, for example, somebody yells in, hey, I'm here, but we never see them. And then later in the scene, they yell back, okay, I'm leaving, and we never see them. We know, because it's OC or OS, that yell is coming from somewhere else. But there's another way to look at this. So when we're talking about story, elements of the story that aren't in the plot are sometimes referred to in the writer room or between writers as events that happened off screen. So an example of this would be in the room. We don't have to show that thing happen or explain that it happened, because there's enough here on screen that an audience is going to assume that X thing happened off screen. Okay, transitioning to plot. So when you're transitioning from brainstorming story, so the dumping process and the researching process, to crafting your scenes and your acts and your episodes, plot choices are made in an attempt to tell the story most effectively inside the confines of 60 pages for a drama, 30 for a comedy, or 60 pages for a multicam. So within the confines of the established page structure. TV plot is meant to open doors, which is to create a narrative that has legs so that you can continue the story and the plot and the development throughout multiple episodes. It's important to remember, if you call attention to a gun over the fireplace in Act 1, you better fire it by 4. This is a riff on something that everyone has heard, and I'm using Act 4 here because of the structure, as I understand it, 5-act structure. So that's where that comes from. Okay. That's the meat that we're going to cover today. Why do we tell stories? Why is it important? What are the origins of ideas? How do we break story individually? And then theme and story and plot. The final segment of today's session is about proposed steps for the pilot writing process. So every week I'm going to give you suggestions of what you could do to start your pilot writing process. And I will just read through this quickly with you, second half of page 6 into page 7. So I'm going to call it an assignment. It's not an assignment in the traditional sense, but if you want to follow along, it is helpful for me oftentimes to have a framework. So here would be a framework. Step 1, assignment 1, notes dump and research. Spend time asking and answering questions related to your project. Pause at any story world or character possibilities that you can think of, and consider what new questions arise as a result of each additional idea. Make note of any and all questions, even those for which you have no answer. As you move through the notes dump process, you should begin to see which ideas are beneficial to your goals as a story writer, and which are possibly beneficial, depending on yet to be determined story choices, and then those which do not seem to be of service to your story world concept. When you have fully explored all possible avenues for your story world, because you've gone through the notes dump process and you filled an entire notebook, then read through your notes and highlight any thoughts and questions that still at this point feel relevant to your more fully fleshed and identified idea. Throughout the notes dump process, research any and all elements and concepts that inform your story concept or characters and require additional knowledge. So that could be weather patterns or laws or geography, industries, anything that has to do with your world that you don't have firsthand knowledge of from personal experience. I find, and I mentioned this, that working with pen and paper assists with the stream of consciousness thought process, and it also sets you up for easy highlighting, but utilize whatever tools best suit your approach. So if you need to work on a computer, work on the computer. Okay, assignment 2, theme establishment. From the highlighted portions of your notes dump and associated research, brainstorm one or more themes for your overall concept. Identify both inherent and intended themes. The way that I would talk about inherent and intended themes, if it's inherent, it lives there anyway. If you're writing a show about a hospital experience, there are some themes that exist there, right? What does it mean to heal? What does it mean to have an ailment? What does it mean to diagnose and treat? All of those things. That would be inherent. Intended is anything you bring to it that doesn't already exist in that world on the surface. Okay, assignment 3, story world backstory and overview. I would call this a story arena. That's the name of the document if you're in a writer room. A story arena is a prose document. So prose meaning just narrative, writing it out, not a script, that unpacks the story concept as a narrative rather than in scene format. Write a story arena for your concept to include events and timeline elements that occur before and after your pilot or feature story. Write chronologically and document the most important story beats. Include a section on time, place, setting, and environment, and a section of foundational or background information on any story world element that may require previous knowledge or a baseline understanding. And these would be oftentimes elements from your research, anything that you think is critical. So one of my sample pilots is about a lot of things, but it includes Roma gypsies. So in my original narrative documents, I had sections on the history and origin of Roma gypsies and how to think about what that means and who they are as a people, as a culture, so that then my reader could be brought into an Appalachian story backcountry that included Roma gypsies. Okay, for example. Okay, it may take multiple pages to fully download the story world. If it's useful, you can indicate which story elements you plan to include in your pilot, but this is not just about the pilot. That's a different story document. So this is a story document about the whole shebang, if you will. Okay, I could grab, if you give me one moment, I could grab a notebook, I think, and show you a visual of the dump process. 1 second. I'll see if so this is all the green is one project, and this is a project I actually haven't finished. Show you some pages. Okay, so I ended up, I'm gonna hold still on this. All of the pen, the ink, blue ink, or thoughts I was researching. The orange highlighting is what seemed to live once I had filled this notebook and the number. So I'll give you some, in this case, I was writing down, okay, here's a character. Her name is 30s question mark, 50s question mark, single question mark. What would husband do? If they are together, they jointly hide the son's wrongdoing question mark. Is it the son or is it the nephew? Would he be early teen or mid to late 20s? Is the son a sociopath? I know you have no context for this, but the idea is I didn't have a whole lot of context either. And then as I went through, I circled 30s, son, early teen, highlighted things that still lived in my mind for this project after I had done, page after page of this. So that's an example of what that process looks like, and also what kind of questions I'm asking myself. Okay, don't know what this is from, but here we go, some theme ideas. How do we revise the story of our own experiences? Question. Rewriting history? Question. What lies do we tell ourselves, others? Why? What should or should we not do for our family what should we do for our family that we otherwise wouldn't? Is it ever justifiable? For whom do we lie? I didn't utilize any of this, but the idea is that thematic questions can bring you deeper into the world that you want to explore. Okay, Alex, I think I'm good.
Okie dokie, cool. All right, well, let's get into some questions. So writers, if you have been sitting on questions like, oh, let me see if Emily answers this in the lecture, now is the time to type those in if they did not get answered throughout the lecture. All right, cool. So let me just pull some of these up. So let's see here. So Vera asks, hi, Emily. Could you elaborate a bit more on watching a movie play out not the way you would have liked? I'd say that is usually a good thing because the writer went beyond the obvious, or does it go the way you expected and because of that turns out to be a bit boring?
Okay, this is gonna sound like self-flattery, but oftentimes I'm like, I thought it was gonna be better. I thought it was gonna be like, why didn't they do X? And I guess I'm just suggesting that there's a lot of overlap. People say there's no original idea. Okay, so we're all rewriting the same thing over and over. So I don't know that I truly believe that, but I do think that if you're watching a movie that you were interested to watch, and then it ended up being kind of a dud because you thought something different was going to happen, I would consider what was something that you thought was going to happen that would have been more interesting to you, and is there a different way to make your way in story to that same end point that was more interesting? So you're not literally copying the top half of another piece of material that you've seen, but you are saying, it got the wheels turning on. I think it would be more interesting if XYZ had happened. How else could I get to XYZ? That's kind of what I mean by that.
Cool. So more of like a thought experiment exercise for yourself.
Yeah, because I think as writers, the more content you consume, the more your brain turns. Like, it's terrible watching TV with TV writers because they know exactly what's about to happen. It ruins it. I can almost not watch anything and just go on the ride anymore. But if I force myself to go on the ride, oftentimes my brain is chugging along, and sometimes my ideas, I'm more interested in what I thought was going to happen than what really happened, which is really less about self-flattery and more about what kind of writing do you want to do, and take note of what comes to mind for you when you're consuming.
All right, cool. So Kara asks, hi, Emily. Could you go back and talk a little more about the idea of X is true?
I'm sorry, one more time. Because I'm also simultaneously reading a question from Asia. I'm sorry, I'll focus now.
No worries. I think Asia typed it into the chat.
No problem.
Not Asia. We'll ask that in a second. Cool. Yep. So Kara says, Hi, Emily. Could you go back and talk a little more about the idea of X is true?
Yes, if I can refresh my memory.
Yeah, I don't quite remember what that is in reference to either.
I'm keyword searching.
Uh, Kara, could you maybe give us a little bit more
Yeah, a little more
context
context.
on that one? Cool. So while Kara is typing, we will go to Asia. So she is asking, can you talk more about writing the outline with A, B, and C story structure? Also, do you need one theme for each episode?
Okay, so I'm going to make some notes of things I will pull into later sessions. I'm going to look at this question again about writing the outline with A, B, and C. So to me, these are three different things: outline, A, B, and C story structure, and theme. So let's unpack those pieces. We are going to talk more about writing outlines, not super thoroughly, but we're going to get there, and I can kind of expand on that outline. So we're going to come back to outline once we know more about how to get to outline. Same thing with A, B, and C story structure. I can certainly touch on A, B, and C and give you some rough guidelines as to how much weight you should offer to A, B, and C, and in what different structural scenarios would cause a necessary amendment to that weighting system. If you're doing a POV series, a singular POV series. So for instance, Dexter, it's like we're through his experience versus an ensemble. There are lead characters in ensembles, but like something like Lost would be more of an ensemble piece. So the weight that you give to different story structures is different depending on the format choice that you have made. We can talk more about that. I'll make a note of that. And then, do you need a theme for each episode? Yes, 100% yes. It is not a silly question. And so the smile for me only indicates yes, theme is critically important. It's very hard to justify your scenes. We're going to get into that later. If we're not clear on what story we're telling, and we don't know what story we're telling unless we know what idea we are circling. So theme for every episode is really critical. Something we'll talk about when we get to character development is about character themes as well. Theme is critically important. Your theme as a writer, your series theme, your episode theme, your character themes. It's a really useful and necessary way of honing in on the ideas that you are exploring. If you aren't clear on what ideas you're exploring, it is all going to feel surface and flat. And the thing that's going to differentiate your work from the next writer isn't about your FDX formatting and all of the grammar and punctuation, which, by the way, I care a lot about. Throwing that all out the window, the theme questions that you have in place for your series, your episodes, and your characters are going to get you to the deeper level of understanding your characters and your writing in a way that talks about implied history, something that we never see on screen. That is what we are bringing to every character interaction now, making them fully developed human characters rather than just a talking head in a scene. And theme is how you know whether or not any of it is justifiable. Should X character do X theme? Well, what is their theme? What are they dealing with? Where are they coming from? Should X scene exist? Well, what kind of, does it help tell the story of the theme? Where are we driving at? All of that is critically important. I think it will become clearer in the coming weeks how to apply theme as well.
All right, cool. And then, so Kara had sent in on the question about talking more about if X is true. She says it was during the theme discussion. I think you were talking about world building.
Okay.
So it sounds almost like, were we like making, it's okay. It's okay. I can go back and watch the recording. Cool. Were we like,
Oh, okay. So, okay. Is this what you're referring to? We don't have to show or explain that. There's enough here that an audience will assume X happened off screen. Is that the reference?
very possible?
Okay. We can
Um,
wait in here. That's the, if
cool.
that's the
So,
thing.
oh, Kara says, no, sadly.
Okay.
We will
Okay.
solve this mystery, even if we have to go back and watch the recording to remember what genius had thought to.
Okay. What was the context one more time talking about theme and world building? Because I can just talk about that.
Yeah, during this theme discussion, I think you were talking about world building.
Okay.
Was it some kind of like maybe making like establishing that X is true in this world? Maybe.
Okay, so here I'd written this and I can riff on this. When brainstorming and world building, sorry, we're on bottom of page 5 for anyone who's interested in following along. When brainstorming and world building, many parts of a story concept will be left off the page, but the story itself is important for developing the broader landscape of the plot. Okay, I touched on this concept in the last answer about implied history. So it's important to know when you're world building that things have happened in the past to bring us to where we are today. And an important question to ask yourself is, why have we arrived here today? There's something called a premise pilot. I'm not sure that I'm going to explore premise versus non-premise pilots, and those monikers can be misleading. A premise pilot is, we'll use the Lost example again. A premise pilot is a pilot where it's very clear why we've arrived here today. The plane crashed on the island today, so that's why we're here. A non-premise pilot is, this is any day of this world, and we just plopped right in. Dexter is another great example that we can keep using. That's a non-premise pilot. Yes, a murder happens that day in pilot world day, but that's not unusual for this world because Dexter is a blood spatter analyst and goes to scenes all the time. So it's just another day in his life, whereas Lost, the plane crashed. So when we're talking about why we have arrived today, as a writer, you have to make that decision. No matter what decision you make there, there's a history that exists for that world, in that world, for those characters, and for the world. I mean, Katrina, let's say you're writing something about post-Katrina New Orleans. That place has a history that if you just walked in the door and had been under a rock for the past however many years, you didn't know about Hurricane Katrina, you wouldn't know, but that was the story world history informing where we are today. Very similarly, you know, if I had a house fire or something that happened in the past and didn't happen on pilot day, happened in the world history, that would inform who I am and where this world is today, even if, you know, we never talk about it. So those implied histories it's complex in that that's how you develop authentic character, is understanding what they are bringing to the table from history. It helps you to know what they would say, what they would do, who they are today, who they want to be. You can't leave all of that out. And much the same when you're talking about story development versus plot, understanding all of those pieces can help you determine what should be on page and why. Understanding all those pieces. So what's not on the page is still informative of what is on the page. Don't know if that's what she was asking, but it's a useful thing to talk about. I see Emily saying hi, that she's from New Orleans. How cool. There you go. So you know what I mean.
There you go.
Emily, IE.
Such a cool city. Okay, cool. So let's see, Miss Cheryl here. First she says hi, exclamation point. So she has a two-part question. So she's curious how long you tend to work on ideas before tackling the pilot, especially if there's lots of background research. That's part one. And if it's a historical fiction piece and you use lots of books for research, is there a way to decide if you need IP, or is anything you read and digest and fictionalize okay?
The second part, the latter. Anything that you read and digest and fictionalize, if you're just using it as informative foundational stuff, most typically you're not going to need the IP. If you, I can get more into that. The answer as I've given it stands. You probably don't need to know more about that based on that question. There is a difference between written by and teleplay by and story by. Those credits are all different, and they have implications based on not only IP, but the breakdown of the work. So if somebody had the idea, if the whole story is my idea, but someone else wrote it, I didn't write it, we're on the same staff, I would get the story by credit, they would get the written by credit. If it's based on an IP, I'll give you an example. The show that I worked on was based on a book series, so it was an IP. And we did credit the author every episode based on the blank book series by blank author. But only once, we learned this early on. I won't say the hard way, but we learned it after we'd already done it. So in my mind, that's the hard way. We didn't get to make the choice. We learned it the hard way that if we pulled a specific story moment or storyline from the book series, even though we're basing the show on the book series, pulling that storyline, not just the world and the characters, but that specific idea from the books and putting it in a script caused us to have to utilize a teleplay by, meaning this has already been written in a different format, and now this is the teleplay format. So IP kind of gives you carte blanche to the world or the characters, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can claim a written by credit if you're using details that have specifically been built by another author, if that's the IP, a book or something. So when you're just doing research, the way to look at it is you are becoming more informed about what you are writing about. There's also something, this is maybe a little bit peripheral to what we're saying, but there's obviously public domain. That doesn't need IP if it's old enough. There's also, in documentary world, there's something called fair use. So I think learning about things, internalizing it, and putting it into your writing, being able to write about a concept with authority because you've done the research, that does not require an IP consideration. Can you please review what the first part of the question was?
Curious how long you tend to work on ideas before tackling the pilot, especially if there's lots of research to be done.
Yeah, I'm like a slug. On a deadline, I can do it. But if you leave me to my own devices, I like to live in it as long as possible. You'll find me just standing and staring at my wall with my arms crossed at my note cards, just staring, because that's me writing. I'm thinking. And so I think the process can take a much longer than many people think. This is gonna sound insane, and I don't want you to stick to this. If you're quick, go. But many people are going quickly to the wrong place. So you don't have to stick to this, but I would say it's not crazy to write a pilot a year. And people are gonna think that's like insane, but if you do the proper amount of story dumping, so like in these notebooks, I am asking every question about everything that I can think of, and I'm playing out every different option until the end of the thought process, and then saying, no, not to that one. Next, through every question you can imagine. Is he a trucker? Is he a roofer? Okay, if he was a trucker, then he'd be on the road all the time. If he's on the road all the time, maybe that's why he doesn't know what his wife is doing on the weekends. If he's a roofer, does he get hurt? Roofing is really dangerous. If he falls off the roof, maybe he has a disability now. Is he on disability? Do they have a lot of money because of disability? I mean, I don't even know what I'm talking about right now. But the idea is you have to play out every single thread, and that takes time. When you hone in on what's most interesting to you, going through every thread, you're not going to have to go as far down the line because there's a framework you've already created, and you know what does and doesn't go into that framework. But when you start, no matter what idea you have to ask and answer a lot of questions, and that takes time. If you're doing historical fiction, I think that was mentioned, it just takes so much research, and that's unfortunately the case. And I'm not saying that a pilot can't be written in a couple of days. It can. And I've seen it done. And, incredible things can happen under pressure. And also when you have a framework, when the show exists already, the characters, the people, the world, it's all just done. And you already know what you're working towards and you're a professional, you can bang that stuff out. But when you're writing your first pilot or you're trying to write a really solid sample, I would say this preparatory time and then the note cards, the boarding that is required, where you're literally plotting beat by beat every scene for 60 pages on note cards, moving things around, making sure that the scheduling is appropriate before you even sit down and write dialogue. Months and months, I would say, months and months.
All right, cool. So sort of connected to this, Vera asks, RE the assignments, should I do these for the entire series, especially assignment 3, before I start thinking about the pilot?
Okay, so I think you're going to be thinking about the pilot from the very beginning, because what you're setting out to do is writing a pilot. So all the thinking you're doing is about the pilot. I think the story world backstory is critical before you, because to me, so we're playing a little bit of a semantics game. It's hard to get you. I think it could be hard for someone to understand that. To me, because I learned, my degree is in television writing and producing. I went to school for this. I didn't learn anything truly necessary until I got into a writer room. So when I think about writing a pilot for me truly is about the breaking process and the conversation and the note cards. It's written. Adding the dialogue later is like the easiest thing to affect. So when I talk about, so the question being, should I be thinking about this before I write the pilot or think about the pilot? Yes, you must think about the story world. Do whatever you want. You don't have I think in order to develop a really authentic pilot world, you must be thinking about how you arrived here. And those questions, I used to think when I was a little bit less experienced, I used to think when people asked the question, well, if you have a pilot sample, you're just showing what you like to write about and that you're a good writer. So when people ask, where is it going? That's just a question they're asking because, they don't know what else to ask and they don't really want to humor you. And it's like, no, you should know where it's going because, and you should know where it came from. Not because it's a fancy commerce pilot buying question, but because if you haven't thought about how these choices have implications to the future and backtracked it, reverse engineered it all, then you truly don't know, you don't have your hands around it. And I think the step 3 assignment of the backstory and the overview and understanding what has happened before to bring us where we are, why are we here today, and where are we going is critical.
All right. Oh, I think we broke up a little bit.
I don't know if you guys can see me, but Alex is frozen. Alex, can you hear me? Maybe I'm frozen.
Yeah, I can hear you now. I think
there you are.
Okay, cool. There we go. We figured it out.
Okay.
Zoom settled down. Cool. All right. So we have a question from Miss Nancy. Nancy asks, will you be... Let's try that again. That was not in Nancy's question. That was an Alex.
Okay.
Will you be discussing flashbacks in the pilot? When, how, and what is appropriate to include in a flashback?
That's a great question. I think I do have flashback in my formats, formulas, frameworks section. I'll make sure that it's in there. Sometimes people there are a lot of devices within pilots that at times could be argued are lazy, like narration or flashback. It's complicated. I think with any device, if you can justify why it's the best way to tell your story, then you can make it work. If you can't justify that, it's probably not the best way to tell your story. There's also a difference between flashback and flash to. A flashback, in my mind, is a more fully fleshed scene with context that the audience can see, oh, we're in the past. This is what has happened in the past. Rather than a flash to being something where it's more cryptic, it's maybe moments, it's a visual or audio or an auditory, so like something kind of inside someone's head, that kind of thing. And I think there's differences between them. There's also dreams that can show you part of the past, but it's kind of an unreliable narrator situation. Was the dream an authentic representation of the past? Also, more broadly, if we're just talking traditional flashback, sometimes the use of flashback, especially in a pilot, I would say, can beg the question, well, then why did you start your pilot today in present day and not in the flashback past? How critical is it that we see this stuff? Can't we just imply it on screen through clever exposition that is hidden within emotional scenes that tell us what happened in the past, rather than heavy-handed handing it over? Here's a scene that happened in the past. Because implied history and really standout television screenwriting is about offering your audience knowledge about the past and the characters and who they used to be and who they are now, in a way that does not feel on the head expository, that is tucked away inside of scenes that do a lot of plot and emotional lifting in the present day, but imply the past most usefully, cryptically, in pieces. So not all at once, but in one scene, I'm going to hand you something that's kind of packaged inside of another scene that speaks to the past that you as an audience member may not understand. And then I'm going to build on that in a later scene with another piece of cryptic information that's going to make more sense, because now you have two pieces, and then a third. And we can talk about how that's done. But the idea here would be, I would stay away from flashback that aims to achieve that handing over of information to an audience as a one-off dump, so that you don't have to do the craft work of taking the past and weaving it into the present and handing it over to the audience subtly and cryptically and leaving them curious and having it feel natural. So if the flashback is necessary, do it. If it's not necessary, don't do it. Because why are we here today and not in the past? I could make a case for including flashback as well. So if you have a specific question, I'm happy to talk about that offline.
All right, cool. Let's see here. We may have already been kind of getting into this one. So this may seem a little redundant, or maybe there's something else that we should address, but I'll go ahead and ask it anyway. So Corrine, oh, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, is asking, do you think a writer who just sits down and starts writing the pilot without this structured approach misses a lot? And if so, what?
Oh, Corrine. Yes, I think that we miss a lot. And that the second part of that question, what is missed, is it's so hard to answer, because sometimes when you've missed something, that's the irony. You don't know what you've missed because you haven't done all of the prep work to get where you need to go. You haven't asked enough questions to even know. It's that whole idea of you don't know what you don't know. And so I guess applying that to the writing process, here are the tactics that I think are useful in getting you to know all the things you need to know, so that you can yes and no all the things. And then you can justify the choices you have made because you know why you haven't made the alternate choice.
All right.
I could definitely talk about that all day long. I think I worked in a writer room for 6 years and on set. And by the end of my tenure on the show I was on, for the final 2 seasons, I was the on-set producer. So I was driving that creative producerial process from page to screen. And I have only, and I worked with very high level producers who ran Nip Tuck and The Closer and like big time TV shows. And none of that happened by accident because they just sat down and write. They just sat down and wrote something. They just sit down and write. It was these incredible brains excavating their brains so that they could figure out what needed to be on the page. Because this isn't, the thing about TV is that it's not a novel with no end point. And we're going to talk about this later, about the scheduling of information. In television, my experience has been, we talk about this as a schedule rather than an order. Because if you have limited time and space, it lives in a schedule. I'm here and I'm out. That's the schedule from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. That's the schedule. It's not, we're going to start at 11 and go until any given time. That's an order. So with that in mind, the scheduling of information in television is anywhere from 30 to 60 pages, and that's kind of it. What I'm trying to say here is you have limited time to talk about big things. And every single choice you make in 30 or 60 pages, you better be able to justify why it's there. And if you don't do some preliminary work to get you ready to type, chances are there's going to be stuff on the page that doesn't need to be there. And you're going to have missed things that would have done much more for you, heavier lifting with less, if you had done more thinking. Now, one alternate approach here, if you're a big rewriter and you're just like, screw it, I'm going to start writing, and you jam out 60 pages, and then you really thoroughly go through and edit, and highlight, toss out scenes and add new scenes, and then maybe that could do it. But I guess what I'm saying here is probably just as much work is going to go into either process. And for most people I've experienced, and at least how my brain works, it's more beneficial to the work and to the process to do it the foundational way that we're talking about rather than the editing way. And by the way, you're always going to have to do the editing way because writing is rewriting. But to this person's question, at some point you have to cut the preliminary and you have to start putting something on the page, because the scary thing can be, well, I want it to be perfect. I want to take exactly what's here and put it on the page. And I'm anxious that I'm not going to be able to like really make that transition. And so then people get scared and they don't just dump it out. And I think that the best way to think about the first draft without getting too crass, because I don't want to swear for people who aren't comfortable with that, but like the F-it draft, just get it down. Just get it down, and it's probably all going to be a mashup, and you're going to have to cut a million scenes, and it might be 80 pages when it's supposed to be 60, but you can't edit nothing, and editing is critical. So if someone feels like they know, because they've been ruminating on this idea for years or something, and they know where it's going, and you want to just sit down and go, who am I to say don't sit down and go? But just know there's probably going to be a lot of lifting on the other side.
All right, cool. Awesome. So Miss Stina has a question. Hi, Emily. Could you briefly explain the process in a writer's room? I think probably like breaking as a group is what she's talking about.
Sure. So a writer room basically consists of a group of people. Sometimes it's a smaller group. Most typically, I would say like 10, 12 people. Sometimes it looks like a conference room. In my experience, it was like a living room setting, a couple of couches, people sitting around in a comfortable setting. And in my experience, it was a smaller group of people, like at any given time, maybe 4 or 5 max. The idea is that we sit down and we say, okay, what's the world that we're working in? If it's pilot, it doesn't really apply because typically a pilot's going to be written by an individual writer or a team of writers, but let's say we've got the pilot in the bag and this is episode 2 and we're in the writer room. So we know the world, we know the characters, we know what happened in the pilot, and we're building from there. There's probably an open door from the end of the last episode. So from there, it's like, What we're talking about are story areas. Just want to clarify, this is different than what we referenced today, story arena, two different concepts. So story areas are ideas of concepts or like tidbits that could be incorporated into any variety of places in your writing. So for example, one that we talked about on Longmire for 6 years and never used was Native American relay races. And so we would have a card on the board that just said Native American relay races. And that was a story area that we could have used as somebody's profession, or as the place where a crime occurred, or where a critical witness worked, or whatever. It's an area of interest. And so when we know what world we're working in and what characters we have and what open doors there are, sometimes it lends itself to, if you're working on a serialized show, you just know you start talking about where are the necessary next emotional steps between these family members or in this workplace, and what would the plot be based on the open door from the last episode. Sometimes you're incorporating in a procedural, you're incorporating what would the crime of the week be this week. And sometimes those story areas are nice like fodder to get that moving. So in a writer room, all this to say, you sit down and you're assessing where you last were, and you start talking about where you're going. And you talk about the characters that exist, the open doors that exist from the last episode, the world that you're in, and any story areas that are useful. And the writer room experience is much more casual than maybe people might think. I mean, we're like watching YouTube and listening to music and quiet or taking a phone call. It's basically stretches of intense intellectual dumping, question and answers. Well, if this, then this, but what if, but don't you think, but is there value to, should we, and then responses and conversation that circles around story work, and then sitting back quietly thinking about what we all just talked about. And then somebody will break the silence and be like, okay, but I think, it's that kind of thing. So sometimes you could walk into a writer room and think, are these people even doing anything? And other times you could walk into a writer room and it's just snap, snap, snap. You're just going back and forth. You're riffing on something, or somebody will say, oh wait, I got it. What if? And there are definitely rules within a writer room, standard practices, kind of etiquette. You never say no. It's kind of like improv, you never say no, you never say you don't like something. You can say that you're bumping on something. You can say it's not working for you, and you have to unpack why. And if you don't know why, you have to make a guess as to why. So you could say, I'm bumping on that, and I wonder if it's because X, Y, Z. And then you have to say, what if? So you have to make a counter suggestion. So when you're doing individual story breaking, you don't have to be so delicate with yourself, but the what if is necessary. Like, that doesn't seem right. So what if this? Different idea. There's something that we talk about in the writer room called bad pitch, which doesn't mean that the pitch is bad. It means, I know this isn't it, but it's something like this. So to get us out of where we are to where we need to go, bad pitch, she wears blue shoes. It's not really about the color of her shoes, but she needs to look different or whatever. So bad pitch is a way into, let's just toss some things around, some ideas around. So the writer room, sometimes you're around a table, sometimes you're sitting on a couch, but you are engaging with the other writers in the room to talk through what would happen next and why. And if that happens, then what is the consequence, and how do our characters experience these changing times? And if you're in a traditional writer room, the showrunner is going to keep that on track. The showrunner is the head writer. They're going to offer the framework. They're going to tell us what we're talking about next. They're going to posit new questions. They're going to tell us when we're moving on. They may also be the person to be writing the note cards on the board. So the note cards on the board, let's see here. This isn't a great example because I don't have any acts up, but this is a project that I'm working on. And these are very broad strokes. There's a card that just says flood. You don't know what that means. And frankly, nor do I really, to the extent to which I will need to understand it once this thing is written. But you're going to start writing out broad strokes on note cards and then more detailed scene beats on note cards throughout the process. Oftentimes that will be the showrunner who's deciding what those cards say. And that's how you're building your scenes. So you're talking about things, you're asking questions, you're saying when something doesn't feel right, you're offering a solution, and you're just weeding out of all the things we could ever write about. What are we writing about today and why? And when we make those selections, what new world exists as a result, and how are the characters living in that world? And then you start making selections and putting them on the board and moving them around, which is to say rescheduling them within a structural format of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 acts, depending on what kind of show you're on. And then that process in the room could take anywhere from, if you're rushing, a couple days. If you're not rushing, maybe 2 weeks of normal length days of story breaking, and you're going to build over time. You're going to be talking about theme, like what theme is bubbling to the surface, or what theme have we set out to mine. And then from there, you're going to develop documents. So the writer of the episode. So as a group, you're breaking the story. And then most typically one writer is assigned to that episode. They'll take everything you guys as a group have decided on the board. They'll take all of that, they'll leave, and then they'll be on script and they will write the draft. And then the high level producers and showrunner will give them notes on the draft, and then they'll do rewrites, and there's all these elements to this process. And before we even get to that, we're doing an outline. Maybe you're doing a beat sheet. We're definitely doing a story arena. And many of those documents are going to be run up the flagpole to the studio first, and then the network. And along the line, we're going to get feedback, also perhaps from the production company as a first step. And we're going to get feedback. We're going to make changes before we ever go to the next step.
All right, cool. And then possibly the last question we'll have time for today, from Miss Valerie. So she says, "Hi, Emily. This is a great lecture. Thank you. With regard to teleplay by, she's optioned a book for which she is developing for TV. So she's wondering, does she need to adjust the credits on the title page of the pilot script? Currently, it's written by Valerie based on the book by whoever. Should we switch it to teleplay by Valerie instead of written by? Or does teleplay only apply if it's like going to air?"
Yeah, I would stick with written by. Teleplay by, and the somewhat arbitrary nature of whether it's teleplay by or written by. I say arbitrary because it's a studio regulation, and different studios have different rules. HBO is very lax, and they'll give you written by even if it's probably going to be teleplay by at like Warner Brothers. So in the development stage, and when you're shopping something around and you've already done the rights and all of that, stick with written by until you have to give it up, and somebody will tell you legally down the line if that's the case. But good question.
All right, cool. Well, we have answered all of the questions, and we are just about at the 90 minutes, so that is working out perfectly.
Great.
All right, cool. Well, Emily, this was just as wonderful as I knew it was going to be. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex.
And thank you, writers, for jumping on and all of your lovely questions.
Thanks for all the questions, guys. I hope this was helpful.
Yeah, and then we'll, be back, same bat time, same bat place next week to do part 2.
Okay, sounds great.
All right, cool. Well, so long, everyone. Take care, stay healthy and safe, and I will see you all next week.
Bye, guys.